For this assignment titled How to Get Rid of Dead Creatures, I decided to focus in on on-farm mortality composting as a way to maximize nutrients from mortalities on the farm. Some of the goals and benefits that come along with composting is that it's firstly an approved way of getting rid of mortalities on the farm as opposed to just throwing them in the backyard or in the woods. And what's one of the best things about composting is that if performed correctly, can really maximize the amount of nutrients and profit you're getting out of these animals, since mortalities in theory are a loss of profit to the farm. So to compost them and use as a fertilizer, as a natural fertilizer for soil, if the farm potentially is growing crops, is the best way to make the use out of that nutrients. And based on the nature of composting, there's potential to store it as well as spread it on crops. So composting is the use of microorganisms to aerobically decompose organic matter. And the fact that it's aerobic is really important because if performed incorrectly, anaerobic decomposition can begin to occur, which leads to foul odors and the inhibition or the growth of pathogens. Whereas performing composting correctly raises the temperature of the internal pile of manure and other nutrients and removes pathogens. So the basis of composting is basically taking a bunch of dirt full of nutrients and placing it around your dead animal, and through the process of turning and moving oxygen and organic matter through the soil, you can begin to aerobically decompose those nutrients. And basically the way it works is it breaks down that animal by removing water, organic matter, and energy. So by the end, you basically would be left with this like humus type of dust or powder or remains of the animal in terms of their bones. And that's how it reduces the carcass size, through those microorganisms breaking down the body slowly, and it happens over a period of weeks. And like I said, if the temperature is high enough and the composting works effectively, you can eliminate those pathogens because the temperature can get up to 150 degrees, which means that those pathogens are in an environment where they cannot thrive. Some points of maintenance that are required for composting lie in maintaining moisture levels to make sure that it's not too wet and creating a leachate, but also not too dry in order to maximize the environment of the microorganisms that live within the compost. Like I said previously, the temperature should be, once it reaches peak composting, should hit about 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and will maintain that for a couple of weeks before the peak composting starts to decline, and it'll decline back down to temperature of the air around it. Another point of maintenance is turning. There actually is a no-turn form of composting, but that requires a different kind of maintenance. Turning allows for that increase of aerobic decomposition due to the increased exposure of oxygen, which allows those bacteria to thrive. It also is really important that when choosing your compost site, you choose one that is conscious of where waterways or groundwater or still bodies of water are around you. You don't want to place this uphill of a major stream or pond where any potential runoff from rain that hits the pile or a manure or a compost pile that's too wet could potentially leach into the environment and contaminate waterways. That would be counterintuitive to goals that we've gone through in this class and goals on a farm. So there are different types of composting, and they kind of go from most basic to most most expensive slash most complex. The basic structure of a composting bin would have a roof, optimally would have a roof. Doesn't necessarily need it, but having a roof reduces the amount of water that is hitting the pile from rain, which decreases the amount of leachate and therefore is better for the environment. An impervious pad is also important in cohesion with the roof to eliminate or reduce leachate into the environment and into groundwater. And sides help for the process of turning with farm equipment. Stack pads are the simplest, and that's basically the process. It's a process that's used on smaller scale farms and is best for dry manure, like small ruminants or horses, as opposed to dairy manure that is more liquid. That would require bins, and that also would require more bulking agent, which is something like dry wood chips, that is able to soak up excess moisture and provide a proper amount of carbon, but I'll get there in a second. Bins are what is pictured here. It is a series of basically bins is what those structures are called. You can see it here in the very forefront of the image. It's basically just a four-walled container. And within the entire structure, there's multiple four-walled containers that allow for composting of more than one mortality. And like I said before, roofed is more optimal than unroofed. Unroofed allows for the impure in unroofed allows for water to hit the piles, which again causes leaching. Some of the issues that come with composting is that it can kind of have some um, cost barriers initially. It does require a lot of time and space, so if you don't have the time to consistently dedicate to composting, it could lead to anaerobic decomposition, which is ultimately counteractive to the goal of composting and becomes more of an issue than the time it takes to compost in the first place. You can also lose a lot of nitrogen, especially in those unroofed um, composting bins where the nitrogen from the manure will volatilize, and that means that it is decreasing the optimal environment for composting for those microorganisms. It also requires some special equipment. The biggest ones would be like a backhoe in order to turn over that manure on a weekly basis. But some smaller things can lie in the details, such as temperature thermometers or a long probed moisture detector that allows you to keep track of the optimal range of moisture for the pile. You would also might consider a tractor that has the ability to move dead animals if you're dealing with large animals like cattle or horses. Again, that potential for anaerobic decomposition, if not properly taken care of, not consistently taken care of, can lead to odors and pathogen, and also can attract scavengers like rodents or even flies can be attracted to that odor and moisture. I decided to compare and contrast on-farm composting with on-farm burial. Um, as a way to show the difference between consistent care with composting as opposed to a quicker, more efficient way of getting rid of those mortalities with burial. So for on-farm composting, it's kind of a requirement to have that impervious surface, like a concrete pad, for starting composting. But on the other hand, on-farm burial, if created in a trench setting, does not need that impervious surface. Um, and I will jump down to the very bottom where I talk about built away from waterways. Although on-farm burials do not have impervious surfaces, it is very important to make sure that farmers are being conscious of where they are putting their burial sites in order to make sure that those decomposing bodies do not leach unwanted nutrients into groundwaters or surface waters. Um, And that is similar in itself to on-farm composting, being conscious of where that site is being placed for risk of the leachate. So composting is on a wood chip based basis in order to balance the carbon nitrogen ratio in the composting. It also allows for moisture wicking in the composting to remove any excess moisture. It's not optimal to have extra moisture in the sense that it can decrease the temperature of the pile, which means that those microorganisms are not thriving in the best environment that they could, which can decrease the amount that they are the time that it takes to decompose those animals. Alternatively, on-farm burials are often in rocky or sandy soils in order to kind of move those nutrients away and disperse of it as the farmer needs to. It also works really well in the winter because composting can kind of be labor intensive. Whereas on-farm burials, if done before the winter season when the ground is frozen, is a really efficient way of getting rid of those animals during the winter seasons. One of the benefits to on-farm composting is the fact that if your animal died of disease purposes, if for instance, if raising cattle and in a dairy herd and they caught the avian flu, the best way to still get the most out of that nutrients would be to compost because those pathogens are killed. That way you know that that virus is not still being spread if potentially used as manure or as fertilizer for soil. But on-farm burial does not kill those pathogens because there is a lack of temperature difference in order to kill those pathogens, which means that on-farm burials are really best for if an animal had, for instance, broken their leg or had birthing complications, etc., etc. Last but not least, on-farm composting does require that specialized equipment to move the piles and turn the piles and move the dead animals, as well as those temperature and moisture probes. Whereas on-farm burials need the equipment to dig a trench. So both of them need specialized equipment, but in their own sense. This is a diagram of what an on-farm burial would look like. I wanted to include an image just to kind of give a visual as to how that's different from the beginning slides showing how the animal was kind of encompassed in organic matter nutrients where it broke down. These animals in an on-farm burial are being buried deep in the ground. You can see that there's some organic matter that is being placed on top with at least 2.5 feet of soil covering. And you can see that there's some depth requirements in order to avoid scavengers getting into the burial sites. And these are my references for my information as well as my pictures.